Our guest today is David Simpson, the G.B. Needham Distinguished Professor of English at UC Berkeley. As you'll soon hear, UC Davis. As you'll soon hear, David is a native of the UK. Did his education at Cambridge and the University of Michigan, and since receiving his PhD at Cambridge, he has taught at Cambridge, at Northwestern, at Colorado, Columbia, and for the last decade at UC Davis. He's been the department chair at Colorado and at UC Davis, and my favorite line on his very long vita is that he recently served on Davis's Committee on Committees. Which has to be a wonderful experience. He's amazingly prolific. He's the author of 10 books. He has edited 4 different books, has 50-plus articles on a range of subjects. His training is primarily in British Romanticism, 18th, 19th century British literature. His first book was Irony and Authority in Romantic Poetry, published in 1979. He also has a book out on the politics of American English between 1776 and 1850. And just last week or 2 weeks ago, his most recent book on Wordsworth commodification and social concern was published by Cambridge University Press. Most importantly for the Global Awareness Lecture Series, one of the most remarkable things about Professor Simpson's writing career has been his ability to translate his understanding of British literature and culture, as well as literary theory and critical theory, into ways of thinking about the modern world, as you'll see today. One of his most influential books in my field, Romantic Studies, is Romanticism, Nationalism, and the Revolt Against Theory, published in 1993, which is a historical undertaking to try to track the hostility towards theory in Anglo-American cultures and finding its roots back in the 18th and 19th century. A few years ago, he published a book called Situatedness, which was about our obsession of explaining where we're coming from, published with Duke in 2002. And then just a few years ago, he published the book 9/11, The Culture of Commemoration, written, as the name implies, on the heels of the World Trade Center attacks, thinking about them as a literary scholar, as someone aware of critical theory by Derrida, by Baudrillard, by Agamben, and others. This remarkable book that is sort of the basis of today's talk, that ranges everything from the history of monuments, the way that we commemorate the fallen, also ranges into architectural criticism, thinking about the various buildings that have been proposed to be erected in the wake of 9/11. So thank you very much for coming today, and let's have a hand for David Simpson.
Nick, thank you very much, and thanks above all for the invitation to be here. It's my first visit to BYU, and so far I'm enjoying it a lot. It's been a while since I woke up to mountains. I envy you all. Nick suggested I might talk from the book, but there's at least something of a convention in our trade that speaking about what you've already written is a little bit shabby and suspicious, so I'm going to try not to do that, though inevitably there'll be some overlap, but rather to draw on what I've done since the book on the subject of 9/11 and what I'm thinking about now. And some of this is in print and some of it isn't, but nothing is in print in the form that you'll hear it today. So one of the things, the book, and am I correct that we stop at 10 minutes to the hour? Okay, I'll be as quick as I can. One of the things I got interested in the book was the whole business of the ethics of seeing and witnessing, what it is to put yourself in a position of confronting suffering full on rather than in some mediated or edited form, or indeed censored form in the case of 9/11. And so today I'm going to talk about that principally, partly through the 9/11 phenomenon itself, partly through the work of one or two novelists, and finally through the work of a journalist. And I'm asking the question, really, what should we see in terms of suffering and death? What have we been allowed to see in terms of suffering and death? What happens when we think we see suffering and death? Because, of course, you really do have to be there to see. And one of the things that fiction and journalism and film does is to give you the impression, the feeling that perhaps you're seeing without actually being there. So it's a very interesting ethical conundrum which a number of people have written about, some of whom I may mention. And I'll just begin by reminding you that of some of the crises of seeing that have surrounded the 9/11 phenomenon, 9/11 event. Things that we were not allowed to see, for example, include the footage of falling bodies jumping from the Twin Towers. Remember, these were reproduced in the early hours of the disaster and in the first day's newspapers and the first day's television footage, but they were promptly removed, tidied away, so that we saw no pictures of falling bodies and certainly no pictures of what happened when they hit the ground. We did not see or hear the last-minute messages from those about to die in the burning buildings. We didn't see dead bodies in general, though there were few enough to see anyway in any whole form. We, some months later, did not see the coffins coming back from Middle East to Dover Air Force Base, though just recently that, you may have seen in the papers that 3 weeks ago that edict has been in place since the first George Bush president. That edict was rescinded, and public attendance is now allowed at the shipping home of coffins in Dover, Maryland. We did not see the other photos from Abu Ghraib. We saw, of course, some. We did not see the other photos, the other 30 or so, that were deemed too horrible to be released. And we did not see, of course, pictures of thousands and thousands of dead Iraqis and others. So here is, the question: on what grounds, other than the pure political cynicism, which of course is front and center, are these images repressed, and what would be the consequences of them not being repressed? Could we, in other words, assume that some important function would be fulfilled by having these things made more available? And there's no easy answer to this, and if that's what I probably am going to be leaving you with. So here's an example from fiction of the sort of things we did not get from the 9/11 reporting. It's from Ian Pear's remarkable novel, The Dream of Scipio, which begins by describing in meticulous scientific detail the sequence of events by which a man dies in a burning building. After 8 minutes, he is unconscious from smoke. 3 minutes later, his clothes start to smoke and his skin begins to bubble. It takes 23 minutes in all before his heart gives out and his breath stops. Assuming Pearce has got this right, that makes 15 minutes of life beyond the end of consciousness, 15 minutes in which those of us reading are conscious, while imagining sensations the dying man is, we hope, not having. Or perhaps we find ourselves wondering, as I do, whether the end of consciousness really means the end of pain, a medical question whose answer is not self-evident, at least to me. So this is an example of the kind of telling of an event, a fictional event, of course, here, which Pearce is interested in, and most of the accounts of 9/11 have not been interested in. Of course, one risks the pornography of death, the uncomfortable frisson that some people may have, or others claim they have, in the sight of this kind of description, in the experience of this kind of description. But what is also avoided is, others argue, a necessary confrontation with the brutal facts of what it is to be a human being and to face one's death. So we make our choice here, and of course choices about this have been made by many others for a long time, really since the age of, even before, one could go back to Homer and so forth, but particularly in the age of mass warfare and mechanized destruction, most significantly, of course, the debate around representations of the Holocaust, in which what is not seen, the places we do not have images of or pictures of, places like Treblinka, which was destroyed and which there are seemingly no photographic records, have this eerie and uncanny threat and appeal for which the pictures we do have are substituted pictures, as you may know, of the liberation of Belsen, often substituting in synecdochically for the whole problem of representing the Holocaust, as if Belsen, which was not actually an extermination camp, although people died there and were terribly treated, it stands in for the whole experience that has become known to us metonymically as the Auschwitz moment. That's how you hear it talked about and reviewed. But more locally and nearer to our present time, the controversy generated by W.G. Sebold's Zurich lectures of 1999, in which he took up the question of German representations or non-representations of the destruction of German cities in the second part of World War II, from really 1943 onwards, when Hamburg was bombed, to the bombings that went through all the way through to 1945. And he claimed that the Germans had repressed confronting the horrors of these experiences, partly out of guilt, because after all they started it and didn't feel they could complain, but for a whole set of other reasons. He argues the images, the confrontation, the awareness of what it was like to be firebombed, to have an entire city destroyed, to have people incinerated, has been ignored and needed to be rediscovered. And this started off a whole controversy about whether it had or hadn't been ignored, and people started digging up novelists who had in fact published accounts of this, but the books had not sold and had not gone into second editions. Novels by Erich Nossack, for instance, and Gerd Ledig. At the same time, roughly, a historian called Jörg Friedrich published a book called The Fire, which was both a very graphic account with very graphic photographs of the bombing of German cities in World War II. Günter Grass took it up in his novel Crab Walk, where he had to decide how to represent the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff, which was a ship carrying some soldiers but many, many more civilians, fleeing the Russian invasion of Pomerania, which was torpedoed and sank with the loss of some 9,000 lives. It is still the biggest maritime disaster on record. Grass decides not to write about the glug-glug moment, the drowning children clutching dolls, as he puts it, the moment that Titanic, the movie, deals in quite lavishly. Well, there's a context for this. When 9/11 happens, the debate's already on the boil, and the long shadow of the Holocaust and the short shadow of the Zurich lectures in 1999 raised this question acutely. For whom would we be representing these kinds of death, and what form should we represent them? What should we see, what should we not see, and what would be the consequences of that seeing and not seeing? So to come back to 9/11, and the relative absence of this kind of reporting or writing, I mentioned briefly Dwyer and Flynn's book 102 Minutes, which is the 102 minutes between the impact of the first plane on the first tower and the fall of the second tower, a mere hour and 42 minutes, in which they try to give an account of the last moments as some kind of historical record, biographical record of those involved and what happened. But bizarrely enough, it becomes a tale more about survival rather than a tale about suffering. It's a remarkable thing that you can do that, but they did. What we see here, again, is still not the kind of thing that Sebold is talking about. The images of human bodies reduced to 1/3 of their size, piled up in wheelbarrows, or lying puddling in their own fat. What got me going with this whole question post 9/11 was, in fact, what we were allowed to see, what we were encouraged to see, was the portraits of grief, the nationally syndicated little bios, which are also obituaries, of those who died in the towers on September 11th, day after day, week after week, published by the New York Times, republished by papers all over the country, and finally collected into a volume called Portraits of Grief, which went into a second edition and now sits on the library shelf. You can look at it. Pictures of dead people, yes, but pictures of dead people when they were alive, a kind of bizarre look-alike to the high school yearbook, in which everybody has a smiley face and everybody has a little bit about them, saying mostly, almost exclusively, what wonderful people they were, how happy they were in their jobs, and what a wonderful image of democratic self-fulfillment had been here destroyed by the planes. Here, on the other hand, is Jonathan Safran Foer, In his remarkable novel, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, Foer's narrator is a boy called Oscar, who lost his father in the towers and is both confessing and repressing that information all the time, and he's looking constantly for evidence of his father, dead or alive. And he says, and I quote, "I found a bunch of videos on the internet of bodies falling. They were on a Portuguese site where there was all sorts of stuff they weren't showing here, even though it happened here. Whenever I want to try to learn about how Dad died, I have to go to a translator program and find out to say things in different languages, like people jumping from burning buildings, which is Menschen die aus brennenden Gebäuden springen. Then I Google those words. It makes me incredibly angry that people all over the world can know things I can't, because it happened here, and it happened to me, so shouldn't it be mine?" says Oscar. Googling in different languages, see. So, should we own up to our own evidence of death, the deaths inflicted on us and the deaths that we cause? It's actually not so easy. How many of you even noticed the moment in 2006? All of you presumably remember the moment in 2004 when the Abu Ghraib photographs first broke cover. Serendipitously, it was not policy. It was a triumph of popular anarchy, whereby somebody's photos were slipped under somebody else's door and went global in a matter of seconds. But then, as I said, the rest of you all presumably remember this, the Abu Ghraib moment. How many of you remember, or even were made to notice, or obliged to notice, the moment in 2006 when Salon magazine, an Australian magazine, got hold of the remaining photographs from Abu Ghraib that we'd not been allowed to see and republished them? The global response was close to zero. That is, they simply didn't register. And these were the pictures which, including the picture of the dead man and whatever it was, sodomized with a chemical light. I forget the gory details. But these were the pictures that were deemed, Congress deemed should not ever be released because they were so complex and threatening and distressing. Were released, nobody even blinked. One can only cynically assume that the news value of the moment had simply passed. But I say this not to say cynical things about news value, although I'm quite happy to do that, but just to note that it isn't easy to claim, and I'm absolutely not claiming, that the simple release of such photographs actually does any good or makes anybody think about anything. There's no evidence whatsoever that it does that. So one of the questions I would like to leave you with today is, what does it do if it doesn't do that? No clear ethical outcome, indeed. Novelists, of course, catch on to the question of seeming to see, and movies obviously do. And if you remember, if you've seen Greengrass's brilliant film United 93, you'll remember how much of the event in New York is actually seen through windows and on television screens. You actually see in the movie people watching television, even when it's going on outside their, as it were, within visual contact distance. You have a flight control tower, I think, at LaGuardia, which is looking toward Manhattan and can actually see what's going on, but is watching it on television. So there's a very strong sense of the mediatedness of all of this. And novelists catch on to this question of wanting or not to see. And I have a number of novels in mind, but I just want to mention today, briefly, Claire Massoud's novel, The Emperor's Children, published in 2006, where the moral is generally that the result of 9/11 for people living in a certain sector of Manhattan's society, culture, and the culture society, is the effect is more or less zero. Nothing really changes, at least for people like us, people like them. We don't see, either literally or morally, and of course it's the moral seeing that matters. The book is a countdown narrative, so the minute you open it, you know what's coming. It's counting down toward the event that everybody knows about because it's already happened. But when we actually get there, the way it's narrated has the philandering kind of New York Times book review author who teaches up at Columbia and who's not based on anybody I know, is looking through the window of his mistress's apartment. He's just finally committed adultery with this young woman he's been chasing, and he wakes up the next morning, he looks through the window and he sees this going on, and he then also turns on the TV. So once again, there's this moment of he has the opportunity to look, but in fact he also looks away at the same time. One looks and one looks away at the same time. And the book is full of these kind of comic apocalypses in which Masood shows the ways in which people really are not facing up to, won't face up to, can't face up to what's going on. And she describes very comically the experience of terror in having one of her characters stuck in a subway car for 23 minutes with the lights out and no information coming over the intercom. His body sweating and his heart pounding. She says, for Booty, it was a mind-altering experience. He wasn't sure exactly how he had been changed by it, sure merely that he would always be different. This narcissistically deranged young man turns this into a decisive and transformative event, a Baudrillardian irreducible singularity that changes his world. She has him saying what, of course, many people said about 9/11, whether you were in Kansas or Kathmandu, it didn't matter. Suddenly, you were told that the world had changed, therefore you assumed it must have, because everybody was saying it had, but you weren't quite sure how. And it certainly wasn't changing unless you were there. It certainly wasn't changing for you in any visceral way in real time. But here's Masood showing how as it were, addictive this idea of mind-altering experience might be, even in the most banal situation, one which every New Yorker experiences on a regular basis, the subway grinding to a halt, and the lights going out and nobody knowing what's going on. That, she says, is what it all means to the people she's talking about. So we don't get it. We haven't gotten it at all. Another book I've looked at is John Updike's Terrorist, which, as you may know, is about another event, not 9/11, but clearly inspired by the 9/11 scenario, a disaster which does not happen in the Holland Tunnel. Updike, as usual, manages to convert the question of global terrorism into yet another narrative of a middle-aged man having trouble with his sex life. That does seem to be Updike's basic contribution to world culture. And there it is again in this book about supposedly terrorism. Ends up being at least 50% and arguably more about middle-aged males looking at middle-aged and younger women. Think also of Ian McEwan's Saturday, which is a book about the abnormality and normality of life in an expensive part of London where Ian McEwan happens to live during the beginning of the Iraq War, and so on. The book, I think, that brilliantly handles this question I'm asking is Don DeLillo's Falling Man, which is brilliant about this question of seeing, because, of course, it's about, if you don't know it, I recommend it, it's about a man who replicates falling after the fall of the towers, a man who dresses in a business suit, chains himself to various public monuments or railings or stairways, and then jumps, but not far enough to kill himself. I mean, he's on a road, sort of a bungee jump, if you like. So the point is, this man is constantly startling people as he goes around New York by popping up in unexpected places, hanging from a railing or a bridge, in this posture which clearly recalls the images we saw but did not see of people, or did not subsequently see, images of people jumping from the towers. So it's really a wonderful exploration of exactly this issue, which I think is metafiction in the sense that it catches what other writers did not do or did not do very well, and fully acknowledges the afterness of what it is that's being what's happening here. Most of the novelists that I've read, and I haven't read them all, fiction is beginning to come out more and more, do in fact dodge this question that I'm interested in one way or another. DeLillo least so, and there are some scenes inside. Foer somewhat not. The novel, interesting enough, which most explicitly tries to go inside, the Buildings was an early novel called Windows on the World, published by a Swiss writer called Frédéric Beigbeder. Has had very little attention. It came and went, and most people didn't think it was very good. The critics didn't like it, etc., etc. But it was different from the other fiction I'm talking about in that it really did try to to imagine what it would be like to be inside the Windows on the World as it gradually became clear to you that you were not going to be rescued, as it gradually became clear to you that there was no way out. What would that have been like? So, back to Masood then briefly to provide me with a hinge for the next sector of what I'll have to say, the next bit of what I'll have to say. And that is Masood's playful serio-comic insight that the thing that most concerns her New Yorkers in The Emperor's Children is staying thin, not getting fat. And she has some savage writing on this topic in which the hero, the man who was stuck in the subway, a young man called Booty Tubb, T-U-B-B, is the object of several people's contempt in the novel because he's fat. Marina, the sort of heroine, is beautiful because she's thin. Her lover, Ludo, is described as a figure possessing a long feline slope. And the low point comes when another character, Julius, his lover, David, is described reaching the low point of his degradation when he is observed moving like a fat man. The only asceticism represented in this subculture is that of the exercise routine and the low-fat diet. And this question of fatness and staying in shape, which of course obsesses our generation, though not me, is my move into the second book I want to talk about in a bit more detail today, and that is the book by Dexter Filkins called The Forever War. Dexter Filkins was a New York Times and LA Times reporter, firstly in Afghanistan and then in Iraq during several crucial phases of the last 10 years of violence. And Filkins is a runner. He likes to run. He likes to stay in shape. I'll come back to this in a moment. But first, before I do that, Filkins is, being a journalist, you might say, is committed to this notion of making us see in the way that some of the novelists perhaps are not. He believes in the power of seeing up close and in telling about it. He believes that's what journalists should do. His reports from the Battle of Fallujah in November 2004 were and are among the most vivid records of combat experience I have read. The book he published from it, September of 2008, contains and adapts many of his on-site reports of the contributions to the LA Times and New York Times. He writes powerfully of the clop of boots and clangs of metal and heavy breathing, of the experience of being shot at, and, just so that you know that it's authentic, one of those things we do not see in the movies, he writes of the difficulties of carrying out bodily functions while under fire in a state of siege. These passages are powerful, and they're a vivid alternative to the romancing of grand strategies carried out by automatic weapons system rather than by the proverbial boots on the ground. So responding to a questioner on the New York Times website, Filkins writes, "It's better to see things for yourself. Your prose comes alive." It's better to see things for yourself. Your prose comes alive. He's not so much interested in the truth, it seems, as in the prose coming alive. You can only know things about a complex place if you see it up close with your own eyes. This is what I want you to think about, this claim. You can only know things about a complex place if you see it up close with your own eyes. I would suggest that seeing up close with your own eyes is not the way to learn anything about a complex place. And the idea that it is a very deceptive and dangerous notion. So here's the other side now of the integrity of seeing. Looking hard at sights, horrible sights, is not an easy thing to do, and Michael Herr, whose own book, Dispatches, is very much behind and is acknowledged by Filkins' own, writes about this in a very interesting way. He says that if you are seeing these things up close, quote, you felt you were as responsible for everything you saw as for everything you did. You felt you were as responsible for everything you saw as for everything you did. Filkins' account has lost this ethical inflection more or less completely, though he does want to make us see, as Conrad wrote, above all to make you see that and no more is everything. The practice, and Filkins writes from within a Marine unit in which he is embedded. Think about this. The practice of embedding reporters within combat units certainly produces a predictable immediacy to people's accounts of experiences of battle, but it also produces an inevitable and not disgraceful loyalty to and affection for those one stands beside and behind, those on one's own side. It only produces a very incomplete picture of an enemy who is seen by glimpses, if at all, an enemy that removes its own dead bodies, does not leave its bodies behind, which is seldom seen but often sensed, which exists only as a kind of sublime absence in an alleyway or a building or in a car filled with explosives. In other words, seeing up close can be seeing up too close, is my argument, and the claims that Filkins makes for this are absolutely not to be trusted. This idea of bringing us the real thing is one that has been taken very seriously by his readers. Robert Stone, no less, a man who certainly should know what he's talking about, a very fine novelist, reviewed the book, saying that Filkins' work might finally be history, that it might be the thing itself, that is history, the thing itself, come for us at last. The thing itself, come for us at last. Now, Filkins, in this compulsion to make us see, and he's been widely believed in this, is also, of course, running a very partial estimate, a very partial account of what's going on in the Middle East. He's become something of an apologist for the so-called surge. He's widely published pieces which claim that the surge is working, that Baghdad is a better place and all that. But above all, he's a runner. He likes to run. And here is, all through his time in Baghdad, he likes to run. And I wonder if there's a better marker of the early middle-aged professional Western white male than the morning or evening run. Nothing stops him. The packs of wild dogs, the checkpoints and gunfire, not the banks of the Charles or the East River, but Filkins runs regardless. Quote, for 3.5 years I continued to run in Baghdad, only slightly modifying my routes, often at night, all without the slightest hostility from Iraqis. A few times he runs with a young boy who appears out of nowhere and is never seen again, then with a young girl who also disappears. He knows that he's courting danger and that if something happens to him, the whole American army would be dispatched to look for me. But he has to run. I needed to run like a wild horse, he says. In homage to his determination, an Iraqi soldier presents him with the shorts and shirt of the national soccer team. Once he's threatened with a gun by a South African security worker, changes his route for the day. But otherwise, he seems to be unstoppable. In Baghdad, that most hopeless of cities, for a few blissful minutes, he says, my heart would race. For a few blissful minutes, my heart would race. Is this an echo of the imperial swagger associated in the old days with mad dogs and Englishmen? An animal released from being constantly cooped up and cautious, embedded with a Marine battalion? A calculated dicing with death that both confirms and confounds the lack of agency that governs so much of the life of a foreign reporter in a hostile place where he does not speak the language. The Iraqis don't run at all unless it's playing soccer. which they do at every opportunity. Filkins never gets this, though. And in fact, the American-built Tigris Park actually replaced the Iraqi soccer fields with a kind of riverside park and walkway which nobody uses. So the ignorance of soccer, lamentable ignorance of soccer, in my view, has its implications politically as well. Filkins is a runner, but runs alone and survives. The commitment to running and running alone is all through the book. It's the mark of his integrity, I suppose, as an independent spirit, one not intimidated by a party line that says, Mr. Filkins, it's dangerous, don't do it. And, of course, the signature, as I've said, the signature routine of a Western man determined to hold on to his habits against all apparent odds. I find the thing really quite weird, the whole section of the book really quite weird. This idea of staying thin on the one hand, but also of making Baghdad safe for joggers, which is what the surge has been all about, according to reading between the lines of Filkins. This riverside park now, where the soccer fields used to be, where Iraqis actually did run around, albeit in a contained space after a ball, is now a jogging space, the liberal democratic dream, if you like. But of course, Filkins is not showing us at any point here Iraq close up. He's not showing us very much at all. This Iraq, this Baghdad that he claims is getting is moving back to normal, is opening shops and cinemas and all the rest of it, fails to mention the fact that up to 1.5 million Iraqis are in exile in Damascus alone. Never mind how many other hundreds of thousands there are over the rest of the Middle East. Just think of this. Between 1.2 and 1.5 million Iraqis in exile in Damascus, where they are not allowed to work, they're only allowed to spend their money, all kinds of social tensions. And the scale of this, by the way, is extraordinary. It's equivalent to 20 million people moving into the District of Columbia. Syria has a population of 18 million, 1.2 to 1.5 million Iraqis moving into Damascus, equivalent to 20 million people moving into the District of Columbia. Imagine how we would handle that. Imagine how we would handle that. That's the Iraq that Filkins doesn't see, because, of course, it's not there. What he sees is those who've managed to stay. He doesn't see those who've gone, those who are not coming back, or those who, when they do come back and the Iraqi government is offering financial incentives for returned emigres, exiles, are often find themselves killed or threatened. So, to leave us 10 minutes and to wind up, do I have a solution? No, I don't. The solution I might have had has been scuppered by what I told you about Salon magazine in 2006, the Abu Ghraib pictures, the worst of the Abu Ghraib pictures, finally published. Nobody bats an eyelid. But I do think back to Michael Herr and to his statement in Dispatches, his statement that you are as responsible for everything you see as for everything you do. You are as responsible for everything you see as for everything you do. Suppose the seeing is not a solution then, but a responsibility and a beginning. And that's the best I can say. And I think of the army sergeant in Iraq who refused to serve further, having watched a man being cut in half by a machine gun, and who had the gall to imagine himself in the other man's position and could no longer pull the trigger. That man was threatened with a court-martial. Later rescinded when the publicity got going, but nonetheless, that man was threatened with a court-martial. His name was Andreas Pagani. He's an army sergeant. But finally and chillingly, we're now in a phase where the biggest chunk of development money in the Pentagon allocation is for robotic weapons. Robotic weapons. Future Combat Systems promises to be the biggest military contract in American history. Robots don't get hungry, don't require retirement benefits, don't need to go to the bathroom during a battle. And as in the words of one Pentagon official appointee, they're not afraid. They don't care if the guy next to them has just been shot or in front of them. So far, the prototypes, this is written in 2006, who knows if I'm out of date already, have been expensive failures. This is unlikely to stop a project whose incentives are palpable for a society anxious to assure what the same Pentagon spokesperson describes as combat without casualties. Combat without casualties. Casualties, of course, on his side. When wars and invasions are carried out by robots, then encounters like that of Sergeant Pagani with the vulnerable body of the enemy or anybody else will become increasingly rare. Rarer still will be the possibility for sympathetic response. The robotic language of U.S. military endeavors is already there. Rolling thunder, urgent fury, just cause, desert storm, shock and awe, enduring freedom. It awaits only the robots to operate its missions. The language is already there. So, above all to make you see, and that is everything, says Conrad in the preface to the Nigger of the Narcissus, but to make you realize, says Her, that it's not everything, that you have to begin with this, that you are as responsible for everything you see as for everything you do. The question of the bystander, the Good Samaritan moment, I don't know what that everything is, but I do feel that in the absence of anything better, it's very important to keep making the case for foreseeing in some shape or form with all its problems and with all its limits and all its complexities. Thank you. We have a few minutes if you have anything to. Yeah.
Wait, the mic.
Oh.
In your opinion, do you think that a consequence of the media and Congress censoring these images has made and still makes Americans complacent and indifferent towards war and conflict?
That's an enormous question. First of all, it's very hard to say what the effect was. I think part of the effect was publicity, and that was a very good thing. I think that my memories of the exposure of the first Abu Ghraib photographs was not that we were complacent, but actually a lot of people were very shocked. Then it got interesting, because the question arises, what were they shocked at? And the responses I looked at troubled me a lot, because it seemed to me that they were shocked not by what was being done, not at the suffering of the person on the other end of, the electrodes, albeit they turned out not to be real. He didn't know that, or the barking dog and the rest of it. But they were shocked that we were doing this. In other words, in a strange way, the shock was not aimed or concerned with the person on the end of the experience of torture, but with the person committing the torture. And I think 75, 80% of the torture debate that ensued from Abu Ghraib was in its very effort a concern, another deep-lying form of complacency, because it was all about our moral soul. Why did we do this? Should we have done it? Will we do it again? It was about us. Okay? It was not about them. It was not about the other. And so I think that and then of course, the debate goes on, and it's going on today in legal circles, in possible lawsuits, in op-ed pieces, in books. The legal community's been very sharp on this, and they were right from the start. With the debate about the Geneva Conventions, the Bybee Memo, and so forth. But a lot of this rhetoric troubles me from the way I look at it, troubles me because it's still very, very self-focused. And so it's not complacent, but neither is it fully alive to the whole range of things that need to be thought about, in my view. Yes.
Your comment about combat without casualty reminded me of something Slavoj Žižek has said, I think, quite frequently in basically every book he's ever written. But that increasingly we find a similar cultural logic in late capitalism of deleterious things deprived of their, we have like ice cream without fat, or coffee without caffeine, or internet porn is sex without sex. And here we have war without war. combat without casualty. So the question I have is kind of methodological. If what we're addressing is kind of something which is part of the warp and woof of culture itself, there is sort of no Archimedean point outside of it from which to address it.
Indeed.
And so I guess the question is, what role do you see literature possibly having in addressing such a problem that is bound up with the very ways in which we ask or articulate these questions?
Very nice question. As I've said many times in the last half hour, don't have a solution, nor do I feel that merely pointing it out or rubbing our noses in it is necessarily going to transform anybody's state of mind. I do, however, feel there is a point in going on and on about it. That is to say, if the effect is only to have us realize, a la Zizek, yes, this is endemic to late capitalism, then perhaps the next step might be to think, well, one has one argument about ice cream without fat. You know, there are certain personal, ecological, and commercial arguments that surround that. But that finally, it's not something on the same scale and with the same implications and with the same possible long-term deprivations of combat without casualties for us. You know, and so there's a scale of things here that needs to be thought about, and the temptation of theory has always been to make everything equivalent, and just to say, well, it's a syndrome we can't escape. It's the zeitgeist. You know, we can't really do much with that. But I always find Derrida inspiring at these moments when, you know, and I think about the introduction to grammatology, close to the beginning of grammatology, where he says, you know, something is happening around us. We can now glimpse the closure of the age of man. We can glimpse the closure of the age of logocentrism. But he says, I do not say the end. Do not say the end. We're not out of it. Nor do we have that Archimedean place to look at everything from some you know, wonderful overarching point of vision. And he also says, and I think this is in, I'm not sure where this is, I think it's in the Pharmacon essay, but he says, you know, the question of where we begin, he says, you must begin wherever you are. You have no choice about that. Where you are is where you are. But where you are is not something that you analyze away as being inevitable. It's a place you begin, you know. You don't say, as a relatively highly privileged, secure Western male, I have no right to comment on other people's suffering. You know, you could just as well rephrase that sentence. Because I am a highly, somewhat privileged, globally privileged, secure Western white male, I should think hard about commenting on other people's suffering. You know, that kind of thing. So I think that's another of our problem, of course, is the besetting corrosions of identity politics, in which, you know, once universalism has been proved either morally fallible or undesirable, and we haven't yet picked ourselves up from the sea of particularisms that replace it. But I like to think of Derrida on this, on both of those fronts. Yeah.